When it comes to portrait retouching, there's a variety of tools and techniques people use to get the most out of their photographs. One staple and favorite of mine to teach is frequency separation. In short, frequency separation is a method of skin retouching in which the low-frequency image data, like the tone, volume, and color transitions, are worked on separately from the high-frequency image data, like fine lines, pores, and skin imperfections. By allowing us to work on these things independently, we can perfect the image without really destroying it. If we keep the textures and clean everything up, we get something a lot more believable. The trickiest part of this process is probably the setup, however, and that's really what this tutorial is about. I'll be taking you through how to set up an action in Photoshop that'll make this a whole lot easier, and we'll take a quick look at how to use this technique. So let's get started. So here we are in Photoshop, and I've brought in a portrait that I've taken. Now this has no color correction done on it. I haven't touched it at all, with the exception of possibly cropping it to an 8x10. And what we're going to do in this tutorial really is I'm going to show you how to set up and create an action for frequency separation. We'll go into a little bit about what you can do with each of the layers that you do create. Really, this is about creating this action so that you can very easily apply this and get started doing your retouching quickly, and you're not spending too much time trying to remember any of these numbers and stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open the action panel. To do that, we can click this little play button here, which is our actions. If you don't see that here, then if you go up to Window, it's the second option down here, Actions, that'll open that back up. Now I have a couple different sets here. The default set with the default actions. I've actually deleted my action for frequency retouching, so I need to recreate it. So let's get started with that. First thing I'm going to do, however, is create a set, and I'm going to call this set Photography. And I'm going to place my action in here, just easier to clean things up. Once we've created our set, we're going to start a new action. So to do that, we're going to create an action using the Create New Action button. We're going to name this Frequency Separation. I can spell, there we go. It'll be created underneath our new set we've created. You could set a function key if you'd like to. We could also color code this. Let's color code it green. And then I'm going to hit Record. You'll notice that the Record button is highlighted, and that means that anything that we do within Photoshop now will be recorded as part of this action. First thing we need to do is we need to create two duplicates of this background layer. So I'm going to hit Command J 2 times and create 2 layers. Before we go any further, I would like to rename these to something that makes a little bit more sense. Now, we could rename these Low and High, but I'd rather name them something like Tone, which is in our low frequency layer, and Texture for our high frequency. Once I've done that, I'm going to turn off the visibility of the top textures layer, and I'm going to select the tone layer. With that selected, we're going to go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. This is probably a little heavy by default, so we're going to bring this down a little bit. I think with this photograph, around 10 works well. What we're looking for is for these tonal values to start to blend together a little bit more. So I think around 10 is good on this image. It's going to be different on every image that you do, and we'll address that here in a little bit. Once we're good with that, I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to turn back on my texture layer. With the textures layer selected, I'm going to come up to Image and Apply Image. Now, by default, this isn't the right setting, so we need to change a few things, and this is where having this action really comes in handy. For the layer, we're going to set this to Tone. Blending, we're going to set to Subtract. And the 2 values that we need to make sure that we've set correctly are Scale to 2 and Offset 128. Now, a note about this. I'm actually working in a 16-bit image. Now, traditionally, this is the settings for an 8-bit image, and right here we would see an 8 instead of a 16. Now, I believe they may have changed this in the current version of Photoshop. If it doesn't look like this and you have a 16-bit image, this is what you need to change. You're going to actually invert this, change the blending mode to Add, and you'll have a scale of 2 with an offset of 0. Now you'll notice it looks exactly the same. If you're familiar with a high pass filter, it looks very similar to that. I'm going to go ahead and leave it like this because this is traditionally the 16-bit, but what you saw before appears to work in this. If it doesn't look like this, then go ahead and use those first settings that I showed you there. So I'm going to hit OK. Now this still doesn't look right, so we need to go ahead and change the blending mode to linear light, and now our image should look just like it should. One more thing before we finish here, though, is I'm going to go ahead and clean this up just a little more, and I'm going to hold down Shift and select the tone layer and drag both of these to a new group and create a group out of these, and we're going to rename this group Frequency Separation. Then we're going to stop recording our action. Once that's finished, our action is complete, and it's really easy to just go ahead and play this back if we need to. I love putting these things in a group because I can turn off the frequency separation once we started doing some retouching, and I can see before and after really quickly. Let's go ahead and test this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the frequency separation group. With my background highlighted, I'm going to make sure I come back up here and highlight frequency separation. I'm actually twirl this back up so it's all we see. And I'm going to hit the play button here, and it's going to run through everything. Now, it did it, however, there's a problem. Well, it's not really a problem, but it's a preference that I'd like to have set, because remember that step when we got to Gaussian blur and I was talking about how we wanted to adjust that just so those tonal ranges blended together. Now that's going to be different depending on the resolution of your image or the size of the model in your image. So let's go ahead and make the action stop at that point in the future. So I'm going to go ahead, and there's a little empty box right here next to the checkbox. That is the toggle dialog on off switch for this, which means that when we play this action back in the future, it's going to stop at this step, let us adjust the value. When we hit OK, it'll continue on with the rest. So let's go ahead and test that. I'm going to delete the frequency separation one more time with my background highlighted and frequency separation highlighted up here. I'm going to go ahead and hit play. Now we notice as soon as it gets to that step of the Gaussian blur, we can set our custom setting here, hit OK, and it's going to continue on with the action. And now we have our frequency separation with our tone and texture layers. I'm going to go ahead and close the actions here to get us a little bit of visibility back. So let's talk about each of these layers and what we can do on each of them. Now with the tone layer, there's a lot of different things we can do. People will use the healing brush. People will use the clone stamp tool. You can use just a regular brush and a color. But one of the things that I always like to do first, and I can't remember where I saw this the first time, but is I'm actually going to use the lasso tool. And I'm going to select some areas of the image and just do some broad just adjustments and smoothing of the tonal ranges in her face. So let's go ahead and grab an area here. I'm going to delete that. I don't really like what I did there. So let's just do right around here. Now, you'll notice that when I've done this, it's got this nice rounded edges, and we actually have some feathering going on. To see our selection, if we hit Q on the keyboard, it'll bring up a quick mask, and we can take a look at what area we have selected, and you'll notice there's this nice feathering here, so it's blending. That's what we want. If this seems a little hard, then go ahead and change the feather amount and redraw your selection. Once you have your selection made, we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and this setting may or may not be enough. If I turn it down, we can kind of see where we start. If I zoom in just a little bit here, we can watch how this affects this. So as I bring the radius up, we can see how those values are starting to blend together a little bit more. So I'm going to keep dragging this up a little bit more until we get something nice. It's probably a little too much. Somewhere in the 20s is good. I don't recommend going with huge values. It can create some glowiness when you're looking at the image from far away. And we're really just working in small increments to try to smooth this out and make a realistic look when we get done with the retouching. So I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. And I'm going to just go around and move to some different areas on our face and do that same thing. Now, once I've already done it once and I'm happy with the results, all I have to do is hit Command F to paste that same effect or filter. And I'm going to pick this area here and do the same thing. And I'm just selecting my area and hitting Command F to sort of smooth these areas out. So let's go through a few of those. So let's go ahead and get this here. Start blending all this together. We could even work on some areas down here. All right, if we turn this on and off, we can see the areas that we've affected so far, looking pretty good. So when you're working on the low frequency or the tonal ranges, you can use things like the healing brush. I'm not a huge fan of it, but people will. Just make sure if you're using the healing brush, you're using the healing brush and not the spot healing brush, so you can sample from a particular area. And make sure that it is set to current layer, not current and below, not all layers, but just current layer. Another thing I like to use more often is just a regular brush. If I'm trying to fix an area that I think needs to have a slightly different color from another part of the skin, I'll use a really low opacity, and I will select that area of the skin to pick a color, and then I can come up and I can paint just very, very softly with that color to you know, fix an area that I want to change. So let's talk about the texture layer. Now, once we've kind of got our tonal ranges smooth, we really want to address things like skin blemishes, lines, etc. So we're going to do that on the high frequency layer, which is our textures. And I predominantly will use the clone stamp tool for this. Low opacity for smoothing things out. I might use a higher opacity to fix specific spots, and I'm probably going to spot check first. So making sure it's set to current layer, I'm going to up my opacity a little bit, and I'm going to want to use a brush with a good amount of hardness to do this, and I'm just going to sample an area and start fixing. And I can do that. I'm only going to use a brush about the size of the areas I need to fix, and those are the areas I want to address first. And it's just going to take some time. Just work through the image. I'm zoomed out quite a bit, but you might want to zoom in to deal with those things. Now, it might be a little much to deal with these lines with this much opacity, so I like to work down here in like the 20s or maybe even less to work with some areas like this. I'm just going to work with a slightly larger brush. Sample from an area of the face nearby that has a similar texture to what you're going for, and then I just start painting over these areas and working this out. Now, if you feel like if you want to try using some more opacity, you know, a stronger opacity to work with this, fantastic, but I tend to stick with something lower and then just work up with these changes. Same thing in here. Now I might want to try a little bit more opacity for this, maybe come up here in the 20s. But I'm just going to work my way around these lines and these areas, these imperfections that I want to improve. And there may be some areas in here where we decide we need to go back and we need to deal with these on our tone layer, so it's just a matter of switching back and forth. This is also like low opacity and working my way around the eyes and smoothing out some of these lines around her eye. Remembering to resample as I go to different parts of her face so that the skin texture more closely matches what it is we're trying to fix. And the key here is to just work slow, and if you don't like what you've done, make sure you're undoing. We can come in and address some of these areas in here, around her nose. So you can see this is all we really need to do. There's lots and lots and lots of different methods out there and techniques for adding to frequency separation or using multiple instances of frequency separation, possibly even adding things like some extra layers in between these two, but I'll let you figure those out on your own or do a little bit of research into those things. But now that you have the frequency separation action, we should be able to go from something like this to this relatively easily. So I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to chime in. I know this isn't everything, and there's a lot of other things to fix in this image, but I usually find that what people struggle with the most is remembering all the settings and getting set up. So hopefully this will improve your speed at retouching and take a little bit of the worry about getting some of your settings right.